Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Lauren Artilles, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am delighted to introduce this virtual event with Nathaniel Rich, presenting his new book, Second Nature: Scenes from a World Remade, in conversation with Terry Tempest Williams. I hope you're all doing well and you're safe. Thank you so much for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like this, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. We're hosting events every weeknight right here on Zoom. And just like always, our event schedule will appear on our website at harvard.com, where you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. So if you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Second Nature on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings over this past year, technical issues may arise, and if they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I'm honored to introduce our speakers. Nathaniel Rich is the author of Losing Earth: A Recent History, which received awards from the Society of Environmental Journalists and the American Institute of Physicists, and was a finalist for the Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award, and the novels King Zeno, Odds Against Tomorrow, and The Mayor's Tongue. He is a writer at large for the New York Times Magazine and a regular contributor to The Atlantic, Harper's, and the New York Review of Books. Joining him in conversation is celebrated writer and conservationist Terry Tempest Williams, the award-winning author of The Hour of the Land, a personal topography of America's national parks, Refuge, and Unnatural History of Family and Place, and Finding Beauty in a Broken World, among other books. A member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, she is currently the writer in residence at the Harvard Divinity School. Tonight, they'll be discussing Nathaniel's new book, in which he continues his acclaimed environmental reportage, examining the ways that humans are engineering the earth they've pushed past the bounds of all our old category distinctions, a nature that is no longer, by any recognizable definition, natural. Oh, the Oprah magazine says, Rich's elegy to a planet he likens to a critical care patient is lyrical, erudite, and devastating. His investigation of crimes against nature and the people who are trying to stop them is alarming, enlightening, and necessary. And now I am so excited to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Nathaniel and Terry.
Thank you, Lauren, so much. And I think I speak for both Nathaniel and I when I thank you and Harvard Bookstore as an independent bookstore since 1932 for supporting independent writers. We would not have a voice without you. And I can tell you it's what I miss most about being in Cambridge is being able to browse in this incredible, legendary bookstore. Hello, my friend Nathaniel. How are you?
I'm great. It's really a pleasure to be with you, and I'm so grateful for Harvard Bookstore as well for hosting this event, and for all of you out there for joining. I know we're at this sort of apex of Zoom fatigue, and so it's especially meaningful that you continue to come out and support wonderful institutions like Harvard Bookstore. And that there are some negatives of not doing this in person, but the biggest positive for me is that um, I'm able to do events with my favorite writers and not limited by geography, and other things. So it's really a thrill to be speaking with Terry tonight, one of my heroes, and one of and just a model for me, in not only in writing but how to conduct oneself in this world. And so I'm really honored to be here with you, Terry, and grateful.
Nathaniel, the honor is mine, and I'm just going to be direct and upfront. I love this book. And for our participants who are with us, it's just phenomenal. I read it almost in one sitting, and I will read it again, and I can't wait to use it with my students at the Harvard Divinity School. And Nathaniel, I just feel like your family. It's wonderful to see you. For those who are joining us, we met in Austin in this wonderful, I can't say an accident, but it was just a twist of fate. And I feel like um, kindred spirits. So the privilege is mine. I want to ask you, because I'm always interested how one makes a transition from the last book. So, how did you move from Losing Earth, which we know is a story about the birth of climate denialism and the genesis of the fossil fuel industry to deceive us, and the power of a handful of scientists, politicians, and unlikely heroes who risked so much to convince the world to act before it was too late. How did you go from there to Second Nature, Scenes from a World Remade?
Yeah, it's sort of it's not a trick question. I guess it's a trick answer in that I started working on what became Second Nature much earlier. Some of these pieces originated as magazine assignments long before I understood that there was a book here. And what I really have been after, I think, with both books is trying to grapple with some of these larger themes of the moment. I think the most important stories of our time about this massive radical transformation of the planet, and with it are the transformation of our own views of our relationship with the natural world, or what we've called the natural world, and to address these ideas through narrative, through storytelling. I've felt that there's I think originally this I felt this as a frustration as a reader, that I'd read a lot of books about the science of climate change, of environmental pollution. Um, I'd read a lot of political histories. I'd read polemics, certainly essays, and I think all of that is hugely valuable. But I felt that what was missing were stories, and really personal stories in which characters not only deal with a wildfire or a hurricane, not that kind of story necessarily, but stories about people whose inner lives have been um, rearranged or overturned by um, this their encounter with this new world that we're rapidly racing into, of just total human domination of nature for better and worse, mostly for worse. And so I felt that was a place where I could go as a writer, where I could fit to write narrative pieces. And so, although Losing Earth is somewhat different in form, and it's focused more narrowly on climate change and not this larger environmental reconfiguration, um, I feel like the books are very closely related, in that they're stories of people. They're both written in the third person. I'm not a character in any of it. And they're stories about people who are not just dealing with these issues in their professional lives, but who are having their own personal lives sort of drastically um, rearranged. And I feel that we're all of us to some degree are in that situation now. And so that's where I've wanted to focus on. And so it feels continuous. At one point, I thought Losing Earth would be a chapter in Second Nature, but of course it outgrew outgrew the bounds of what this book was. And so yeah, so they feel like twins in a way that were born out of order in a sense.
They do feel sequential, and I think what moved me most is exactly what you're talking about. I mean, you are a storyteller, and we see this merging of your lavish talents as a novelist, as a fiction writer, as well as with your sharp-edged journalism. And the protagonists, each one courageous, risking so much to hold their integrity, and to dare to go to the source of things. Would you like to read for us, just so that we can get a sense of your voice on the page?
Sure. Yeah, so I'll read from the introduction. And this is the one piece that's not really a story, I suppose, but I think it'll set up the
Mhm.
framework for the stories that follow in the book, for because I'm assuming nobody, the book is just published, so this will give you a little sense of what's in it. Okay. What we still, in a flourish of misplaced nostalgia, call the natural world is gone, if ever it existed. Almost no rock, leaf, or cubic foot of air on Earth has escaped our clumsy signature. As Diane Ackerman has written, it's as if aliens appeared with mega mallets and laser chisels and started resculpting every continent. We've turned the landscape into another form of architecture. We've made the planet our sandbox. No one's better articulated the incoherence of the nature ideal than the historian William Cronin in his transformational The Trouble with Wilderness. Nature, he writes, is quite profoundly a human creation. As we gaze into the mirror it holds up for us, we too easily imagine that what we behold is nature, when in fact we see the reflection of our own unexamined longings and desires. The idealization of wilderness is not merely a myth, it's antagonistic to the aims of any environmentalist. For if, in the future, something resembling wilderness is to survive, it will be only, quote, by the most vigilant and self-conscious management. Our most prized wilderness areas are already the beneficiaries of government regulation, political compromise, and the constant round of interventions, euphemized as land management. Even the rewilding movement, which preaches benign neglect to allow nature to recover at its own pace, acknowledges the need to meddle. Wilding, Isabella Tree's account of the transformation of her English estate into a nature refuge, details the installation of barbed wire, the importation of longhorn cattle and trapped deer, and generous applications of glyphosate. The engineer and the ecologist have been enemies from the cradle. Since its founding as a discipline in the 18th century, civil engineering has sought to bring an unruly planet to heel, flattening infelicities of grade and angle, simplifying rugged terrain into a planar grid, routinizing chaos. But in recent decades, a shift has begun. Engineers have designed buildings shaped like mountains to reduce their emissions, wind turbines that mimic whale fins to increase efficiency, bricks of bacteria that inhale carbon dioxide. They've achieved a more powerful control of nature through the imitation of nature. Ecologists, meanwhile, have accepted that a threatened ecosystem requires steady interventive care, as might any patient in critical condition. Two dovetailing observationists by the novelist William Gibson describe the next chapter of this history. The first is hardened into platitude. The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. The other is soul delay, the idea that during long-distance flights, the human body travels faster than the spirit. The uneasy sensation of waiting for your soul to catch up is what we call jet lag. We now inhabit a similar lag, a nature lag. The future is already here, unevenly distributed. We recognize its hallmarks: rising sea levels, regular visitations of apocalyptic natural disasters, the forced migration of tens of millions, accelerating extinctions, coral bleaching, global pandemic. Also, cultured meat, re-engineered coastlines, the reanimation of extinct species, bunny rabbits that grow fluorescent green. Our souls haven't caught up. Even in the most optimistic future available, we will profoundly reconfigure our fauna, flora, and genome. The results will be uncanny. It will be difficult to remember that there'll be no more uncanny than our carpeting of the American Southwest with lush lawns transplanted from the shores of the Mediterranean, our breast-augmented chickens, our taming of the world's most violent rivers. If our inventions seem eerie, it's only because we see in them a reflection of our desires. It's impossible to protect all that we mean by natural against the ravages of climate change, pollution, and psychopathic corporate greed unless we understand that the nature we fear losing is our own. The conservation of nature means the conservation of our identity, the parts of us that are beautiful and free and sacred. If we don't defend those soft parts, all we'll have left are holograms of our worst instincts, automatons impersonating our nightmares, and a slow drift into a desert of biblical dimensions, a tract of solitude and savageness. What follows are stories of people who ask difficult questions about what it means to live in an era of terrible responsibility. In the first part, Crime Scene, a series of amateur detectives investigate crimes against nature. Confronted with the worst of humanity, they ask, who let it come to this? The stories in Season of Disbelief are about people whose fundamental understanding of the physical world is mocked by a new reality. When our land, food, and climate no longer resemble anything we've known, how do we avoid losing our humanity too? We are as gods and might as well get good at it, wrote Stuart Brand in the Whole Earth Catalog. He's since revised this to, we are as gods and have to get good at it. We know what it looks like to be bad at it, because we're not gods, but primates plagued by fear and hubris. Impersonating divinities usually ends in humiliation. And as gods, artists and engineers navigate unintended consequences, ethical cul-de-sacs, and their own vanities as they struggle to create a more human future. The trajectory of our era, this age of soul delay, runs from naivete to shock to horror to anger to resolve. There's no better avatar of this transformation than Robert Bilott, a corporate defense lawyer who started as a man of DuPont's America and became a man of the future. And then we have the story of Rob Bilott and his lawsuit to try to save humanity. Yeah.
It's such an insightful and clear introduction. And as you say, the book is divided beautifully into those three categories: crime scenes, seasons of disbelief, and as gods. I'd love to look at three of those stories from three of those sections. So could we start with Bob Bilott? Is it Bilott? Is that how you pronounce it?
Bilott, yeah, Bilott, yeah.
What was interesting in terms of his relationship to his law firm and DuPont, and this is in West Virginia where it starts. And I just have to say, I was fascinated by the similarity between Mr. Bilott and Rachel Carson, that both of these citizens, professionals, one an attorney, another a writer and a scientist, were contacted by a local person. In this case, Wilbur Tennant in West Virginia, who was a rancher, and in Miss Carson's case, Olga Hutchinson's, who was a resident in Massachusetts, who wrote Miss Carson a letter saying that her birds were dying, being poisoned. What we found out was from DDT. Can you talk about this ethical response versus a corporate one, the personal price paid, and the tenacity and courage of both the Tennant family and this extraordinary attorney?
Yeah, that's a fascinating comparison. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but you're right. It does track. Rob Bilott is a fascinating figure. I mean, he was a very conservative guy, buttoned up guy. He was a corporate lawyer, and his job was to defend chemical companies like DuPont from environmental lawsuits. And one day, and he had also, I should say, this enormous faith in American corporations and American business, and he saw his job as helping, these massive corporations to do the right thing. That they wanted to do the right thing, and his job was to help them do it. And so he gets this call from this cattle farmer, Wilbur Tennant, who says his cows are dying left and right, and he blames DuPont, which has this enormous factory in this outside of this town of Parkersburg, West Virginia, that's completely run and owned by DuPont. And nobody in town will listen to Tennant. He believes that DuPont has been flushing some kind of hazardous waste into this property that leaks through this creek into the creek where his cattle drink from. And he calls Bilott because they have a sort of tenuous family connection, and that Bilott as a child used to go to his grandmother's farm nearby, and he had he had great nostalgia for these summers that he passed in this bucolic area, beautiful area of West Virginia. And so he sort of reluctantly agrees to take the case as a favor to his grandmother, while explaining that he's actually the exact wrong kind of lawyer. His job is to, protect chemical companies, not sue them. And he soon, and he expects just to find, that this is some kind of misunderstanding. But what instead he discovers is, I think it's not an overstatement to say, is one of the largest criminal conspiracies in American corporate history, which is that DuPont, in the manufacture of Teflon and other non-stick surfaces that are, the applications of which are just pervasive in our world, our society. had been using this man-made chemical PFOA that doesn't biodegrade. It's called a forever chemical, and they knew that it was toxic. They knew from just about the beginning of the use of this chemical in the 1950s that it caused horrific health conditions, birth defects in factory workers, and so on. And the story, and so he pursues DuPont, and he uses his insider knowledge essentially to nail DuPont, because he's able to figure out where the bodies are buried, and he also has this incredible stamina of sorting through millions of pages of documents over the course of decades.
It was like a movie. I felt like I was watching a movie.
Well, it became a movie. It did become a movie, actually. The Dark Waters is the film, and Mark Ruffalo plays Bilott, and it's one of the most incredible performances, because Bilott in person has essentially no emotional expression, but inside he becomes just completely first disillusioned, and then overwhelmed with rage and fury, and this kind of righteous anger that I think that drives him to this day, and a great personal cost to him.
He was an embarrassment to the firm. He was losing money for the time he was spending on this. That image of billions of papers and boxes, and then I loved Nathaniel, how he never settled. The first settlement of what DuPont offered would have been more than enough for a lot of the people, but he didn't. He just kept going deeper and deeper, holding them to account. And what I thought was so interesting is when you said, DuPont's allegiance was not to public health, or to doing the right thing, but only to their shareholders. And he just kept holding the line until it became, what was it, $600 million lawsuit?
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, he got a 600. I mean, first it was the tenant case, which he resolved fairly quickly once he got these damning documents and figured out what was going on. But then, as you said, he shocked DuPont, because then he went after them for poisoning the whole community, which had been exposed to this stuff. And he ended up, after just an excruciatingly difficult and long fight that put his career in jeopardy, as you said. He ended up getting a $670 million settlement with this whole class. He's actually since gotten another 200 plus million for the town in the last couple of months. There was a new phase of the settlement. But even then, he wasn't satisfied, because what he discovered, and this is sort of the most haunting thing about the story in a way, is that it wasn't just the local community that was being poisoned, that because these chemicals, we've been, cooking with them for decades, they've entered into the bloodstream of every human being, and not only human beings, every living animal that's been tested for it, including, albatrosses in the middle of the ocean. And so he realized that, this has become essentially part of our biological inheritance now. It's passed down from mother to child. And so his newest effort is a lawsuit on behalf of every American citizen. And if he had jurisdiction, he would be suing on behalf of every person in the world.
And species. Would
Yes.
you just read that litany of species on page 50, so that our readers can hear that, as you said, what started out local with the Tennant family, that then became, the state, and then the country, and now beyond our own species. This touched me so much.
The line about where scientists have tested that.
It's on page 50, and you list the animals that were tested.
PFOA is where they've tested for the presence of PFOA. They found it. It's in the blood or vital organs of Atlantic salmon, swordfish, striped mullet, gray seals, common cormorants, Alaskan polar bears, brown pelicans, sea turtles, bald eagles, California sea lions, and lace and albatrosses on Sand Island, a wildlife refuge on Midway Atoll in the middle of the North Pacific Ocean, about halfway between North America and Asia.
So talk about your argument of second nature and the Anthropocene, of the weight of our presence. I just found this searing. If we move to, I'm so aware of our time, I feel like we could talk for hours. In scenes of disbelief, as a Westerner, I was fascinated by your story, Aspen Saves the World. And I mean, just your opening page, I was laughing so hard because of the truth of it when you said this is a community where dogs wear cashmere sweaters and swarovs crystal collars. They're given a doggy lag kit, at a particular hotel just for dogs. And then a community that welcomes 13,000 private jets when the population is 7,401 people. You set this scene of a very privileged town in a very beautiful terrain. But again, the courageous and driven people. Can you talk about this town that depends on snow, even as it's losing snow, and that incredible line that you write, Aspen is even losing its Aspen? And I'd love you to talk about Auden Schendler and the Koch brothers.
Yeah, it's a town that depends on snow and the kindness of billionaires, right? And it's one of the richest, most ludicrously rich places in the world. And the story is about this Auden Schendler is this fascinating figure who was named by Aspen Ski Co., which is the biggest business in town. They run most of the town, to become VP of sustainability. Something like that was his title, but his real job was essentially to save snowfall, and ensure that Aspen in the future will have snow falling on its slopes. And he developed this whole idea that is somewhat hubristic and crazy, but has a real core of logic and integrity to it, which is that Aspen is rich enough and powerful enough that when it moves with purpose, it can influence global, opinions. It can even be a kind of economic driver towards, things like renewable energy and solutions over climate change. And so the idea is basically Aspen will save the world from climate change. Now, on its face, that seems preposterous, of course, because it's not only this hyper privileged place, it's also the residence of every single oil baron and Saudi prince and Russian petro oligarch and so on have houses there. It's not necessarily the kind of community you would expect to be sympathetic to these ideas, and yet Schendler actually succeeds pretty well on his terms. I mean, he hasn't saved snowfall necessarily, but in doing so, he develops these unusual partnerships, including with his most sort of hated rival, which is one of the Koch brothers who lives in Aspen and also owns his own mountain valley that's larger than Aspen itself. And the solution that Auden Schendler works out with Bill Koch is to convert a coal plant that's dying into essentially a renewable energy plant using the escaped gases from the plant. And it's the kind of story that it's like so many of the stories that I think I'm drawn to. I see in sort of in retrospect, it's not exactly a feel good story, and it's a complicated story. It's about people trying to muddle through, people with great flaws, but also great hopes and aspirations. And someone like Schendler, his heart's really in the right place, and he's trying to change the world, and yet he also can't be a purist about it. And it's something that you've written about so well, and about you've this family that's in gas and laying pipelines in the West. But I think it's a dimension to it, a sort of moral dimension to this crisis that I for one want to read more stories about what kind of as this transformation continues, how do we navigate these moral questions about working with people that we don't believe their politics or support their practices, or and how do we take care of people who are left out in these transitions?
And I thought you brought up so many interesting points. One, the difference between generations. The older generation that only sees 20 years ahead and says, please don't dam, don't put a hydro factory, dam in the Roaring Fork River, or in that area, damming the river. Whereas a younger generation sees the need for complexity, and they're looking 50 years, 100 years down the road, that if we don't dam that river now, then there will be no river later. And I think you make these stories more complex than we know. And I think each story talks about engagement and acts of the imagination and shattering old alliances, like you said, between Schindler and Mr. Koch. And then, just when we're thinking, this is so encouraging, you say, but it's over, and then you pivot to Billy Barr in Gothic, Colorado, this kind of hermit that lives in a cabin who has all the most valuable information of all, which consists of a weather journal and a phenological report of, you know, when the sage bloom or when the storms rose, or, can you talk about that? I thought that was
Yeah,
fascinating.
he's one of my favorite people that I've met, in not
Beautiful.
just in reporting and in my life. Basically, there's in the next valley, it's above Crested Butte, Colorado, in an old abandoned, it's like a ghost town called Gothic. There's this incredible nature laboratory, called Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, and every summer when the snow melts, because otherwise it's essentially inaccessible, all of these scientists from around the world come up into the top of this mountain valley, um, up this dirt road, and they conduct these experiments, including some of the longest running climate change experiments in the world. And it's just this incredible like summer camp for obsessive scientists. But at the core of it is this guy, Billy Barr, who's essentially the janitorial staff, and he's the only person who stays there in the off season. And he's this hermit. He has the look, this long flowing white beard. He came up there, I think something like 45 years ago as a college student and never left. And he just sits in he has this little shack up in the hills, um, and looks after everything, and is snowed in for half of the year, completely on his own. But sort of accidentally, unlike everyone else there, he's not a PhD. He's not a trained scientist, but he keeps these wonderful nature journals, essentially, and including an avalanche journal. He marks every avalanche, which is a frequent occurrence up there. And those journals have become some of the best climate records of our time. He measures snowfall. He measures the rate of avalanches, the first day of spring, the first snow, that kind of thing. And his journals have become sort of the most important experiment of them all. And he's just a fascinating figure who I felt just in relatively short, in short conversations, he conveyed the majesty of the place and the tragedy of what's happening there.
I just thought that was so beautiful. And again, it reminded me of the contributions of other naturalists, like the Craigheads. Frank Craighead, who is, studied grizzly bears, his entire life kept a little spiral notebook in the front pocket of his cowboy shirt. And that's where his field guides came from, so that he knew that when the steer's head bloomed, that was also when the mountain bluebirds returned, this relational. And same with Aldo Leopold. Their family has over 70 years of phenological reports, beginning with their father. And they have found that the Canada geese or the sandhill cranes that would leave by Halloween now stay through January. Just so you give great credence, Nathaniel, to citizen science, which I think is so powerful in this book. I feel like we're racing, but I want us to talk about the pigeon apocalypse. I just was so moved and blown away by that. And this fascinating character, Ben Novak. And I'm wondering if you would just read the first 2 pages, because I think they're so beautiful. And it gives
Sure.
our readers here a look at your lyrical language as well as your sharp-eyed reporting.
All right. Happy to. This is about Ben Novak, who's also just a completely fascinating guy, a little younger than me. The first time Ben Novak saw a passenger pigeon, he fell to his knees and remained there speechless for 20 minutes. He was 16 years old. At 13, Novak had vowed to devote his life to resurrecting extinct animals. At 14, he saw a photograph of a passenger pigeon in an Audubon Society book and, quote, fell in love. There was a single passenger pigeon in his home state of North Dakota, but it was locked in the research collection of the Historical Society in Bismarck. He had no idea that the Science Museum of Minnesota, which he was visiting with a summer program for high school students, had pigeons in its collections. So he was stunned to encounter two stuffed specimens, a male and a female, mounted in lifelike poses. He felt overcome by awe, sadness, and euphoria at the sight of the birds' beauty, their bright auburn breasts, their slate gray backs, and the dusting of iridescence around their napes that, depending on the light and angle, appeared purple, fuchsia, or green. Before his chaperones dragged him out of the room, Novak snapped a photograph with his disposable camera. The flash was too strong, however, and when the film was processed several weeks later, he was haunted to find that the photograph came back blank, just a flash of white light. And that's the beginning of a lifelong quest to bring back the passenger pigeon, and he's doing it.
I just love this chapter. It is epic. And this whole idea of de-extinction and Stuart Brand with the long now and this convergence of scientists and dreamers and visionaries. How did you find this story?
You know, I think I must have just come across some of their earliest work when they one of the first things they did, this organization that was started by Stuart Brand and his wife Ryan Fallon, was to convene an ethics panel, essentially, of just the people at the luminaries of conservation thought and biological ethics and so on, and got them together to say, is if we can use these new genetic technologies to bring back extinct species, should we do it? And it was a fascinating debate that, to some extent is still going on, although they've essentially won the debate, that, the proponents of this kind of thing. The winning, it's sort of surprising to me, the winning argument was essentially the one made by these two Stanford ethicists who published a piece, I think in the journal Science, where they said, verbatim, we should do this because it's cool. There's like a cool principle of which of course seems terrifying, like if we just did things that were cool without regard, but the larger idea was that, when we invent these tools, these incredibly, powerful, precise tools, someone's going to use them. And, it behooves us to figure out, well, how should they be used? What's the responsible way to use them? The other striking thing that I learned in the research that was shocking to me, was that actually they're not bringing back the passenger pigeon. They've been able through genetic mapping to create an approximation of this bird that used to be, I should say, the most populous bird in the species and just dominated the continent.
When you talk about flocks that were recorded of 3 billion birds?
Yeah, flocks of billions of birds that would take, days and days to fly past. And this was a common occurrence in, 150 years ago even. But they can get an approximation of this bird, but they can't get an exact replica because they're extinct, of course, 100 years ago. And so what they're doing is actually creating a new species of pigeon that resembles the passenger pigeon as closely as they can, but essentially a new man-made species. And their idea is that is to fill the ecological niche that was emptied by the loss of the species. And so it's a good example of the kind of stories that fascinate me, where first brush with them, something seems very almost sinister or creepy about it, the idea of using technology in this way. And yet this organization, they're motivated not really by the cool factor, but by really foundational thought of the environmental movement, sort of original conservation thought about, the role of people in the web of life and the importance.
I thought that was interesting that in the end, Novak said, in the end, it's all about habitat and the ecological aspect. I have to tell you as a reader, who has devoted one's life, to wilderness, public lands, ecological principles. This was the this was the story that changed my mind, opened my mind to, and it was your argument that when you go to Milan to see the Last Supper, painted by Da Vinci, it's not the real thing. And yet we experience it as the real thing. And just that whole notion of reality, the Dalai Lama talks about that we disparage plastic flowers, saying it's not the real, but what he says is the plastic flower is the real if it is real in your own mind. So this one was the most esoteric and impactful for me, I have to tell you, Nathaniel. It was so provocative and evocative at once, and it really moved me. And
Thank
again,
you. It's a hard, it's something I struggle with as well. I mean, I don't feel totally resolved about the issue, but I also feel that we're,
nation, and
yeah.
the moral imagination, how we choose to look at it.
Yeah, and it's the idea, foundational idea of this work is that in order to conserve something, we have to decide what needs to be conserved. And in other words, Ben Novak would say, so much of our original like mapping, say, of ecosystems in the continent occurred in the 1920s and 30s, when of course nature of that period was the most degraded it had been ever, essentially, in this continent because of human activity. So you have to define, well, where do you want to get a forest back to? Where do you want to get the land back to? What's the point? Is it, if it's not 1930, is it 1830? Is it 1430? Where, and we're now also at a point where if we don't act, we're already intervening so dramatically and drastically, in a reckless manner.
It comes down to what is our responsibility now as human beings responsible for this demise. The last story just undid me because of where you took us. I mean, and that's with the green rabbit, which, of course, is on the cover of this magnificent book. We have 3 questions that I want to get to. And so we've got maybe 5 minutes to talk about this. And whether you want to read the closing few pages, or whether you want to talk about what was so interesting to me is how you brought us back to the tension between art and science, and what this artist, Eduardo Koch,
It's actually pronounced cats, strangely enough, although you
Cat,
would never know it
um,
from how it's spelled.
and the French laboratory, near Versailles, what that tension was with this glowing fluorescent green rabbit,
Yeah,
and how you bring us back to soul delay and how our soul has to catch up with where we are.
Yeah, it's about this artist, who the work of art was this GFP bunny. GFP is this genetic, this gene that is taken from a jellyfish, that glows in the dark, essentially, and was implanted into rabbits, albino rabbits, to make them glow green. And the artwork was to display a rabbit like this, who he named Alba, and then ultimately to adopt the rabbit into his home, and bring it home to Chicago, which never happened because he was instantly embroiled in this kind of international global, scandal, and people were really upset that he would be, using these genetic methods to create art, using innocent animals and so on. And the irony, of course, in his point that he made then very loudly, was that he had actually done no such thing. He had not produced the rabbit. These rabbits are already manufactured, as they say, in these institutions that use them for testing, often testing things like vaccines, and medical formulas. And all he had done was bring it out into the public. And I felt it was almost a parable about where we're at, which is that the technology is developing so fast. Genetic technology, but also some of these other technologies about, that I write about in the book, reconfiguring land masses and so on. And they happen and are adopted by specialists and experts and corporations long before they enter into the public realm. We can't catch up with it, and often it takes an artist like Katz to bring it out into the open. And so he got this incredible amount of scorn, but really the scorn was really should have been directed at this activity that had already been going on for many years, and that within the scientific community was sort of old hat even by the time he took it out. And so I feel it's a powerful story. His story is a powerful story about the responsibility of artists, not only to bring some of these issues out to the public, but really try to grapple with them in a profound way, in a way that goes beyond what a sort of academic ethicist could do, and talk about the ways in which these things are touching our personal lives and changing who we are and how we see ourselves.
Well,
And so it felt like the right place to end the story,
it was
the
so
book.
And that quote, the function of art is to expose areas of life that we don't have the proper language to describe. It is to seek out zones of discomfort. But the difficulty is to stay in those zones of comfort. So I'm going to reserve my last question for you in the last minute that we have. But let's look at the questions from our viewers. Katie Simpson Smith says, I'm curious about how you approach the natural world in your fiction. In your last two novels, you really focused on these grand battles between humans and their manipulation of the environment. And you made the point tonight that nature is now inextricably from our impact, is now inextricably with our impact. I wonder if you've ever attempted to just wax poetic about a meadow, divorced from the image of a man tramping through it.
Thank you, Katie, for the question. That's a very good question. I think what interests me is this intersection between people and the natural world. But of course, as you say, there's no breaking it up. And in fact, it's one of the original insights of ecological thinking, and conservation thinking, that there is no separation of human beings and the natural world, that our fates are wrapped together. We're one and the same. And once you have that awareness, then you start to see that, our activities can have, these hugely detrimental effects. And so I think that the modern version of that conundrum is not only, becoming aware of the damage we can do, but trying to determine, how can we use these technologies in a responsible way, in a way that brings us back to the kind of values that we claim as the basis for our society. How can we use, move forward and, appealing to our better angels rather than just drifting into the chaos of ecological devastation.
The next question is, could you talk a bit about the irony of corporate figures trying to salvage nature when corporations are usually responsible for its destruction?
Yeah, hugely ironic. And I think one has to take any of those, ideas with great skepticism. I mean, if you look at, there's no greater villain in the book than DuPont, which essentially follows the same, strategy as the oil and gas industry has for decades, minimizing the problem, denying it, and while internally, developing this strategy, this very cynical strategy, with the idea that they're already on the hook for the damages, so there's nothing to gain from coming out and trying to help the problem at this late date. And so I don't put any great faith in corporations leading the way, but I do feel that in order to compel corporations and compel the governments and these larger institutions in our society to act, to do the right thing, essentially, we have to first figure out what the right thing is, and we have to define more precisely what we're comfortable with and where we want to go. And so I think there's more to it than simply finding the villains and holding them responsible, although of course that's a big part of the story. We also have to really grapple with how the level of transformational change that we need to save ourselves, essentially, so dramatic that we need to be taking some really, major actions. I mean, I write about one in the book about the Louisiana's plan to rebuild the coast. And we also have to explore what are the, the costs of some of these actions. What are the costs of trying to save, the coast, of trying to save North American forests? Even when we decide that it's, what we want to do, that it's the right path to take, we also have to understand where we will lose some things in the process as well.
Here's a question, and this may be the last one we have. And it goes back to the notion of inhabiting the zones of discomfort. The question is, how do you find relief from the existential stress that you inhabit looking at these precarious ecological situations? And what gives you hope to keep doing the work? And I guess what I would add to that, Nathaniel, is, the power of you as a storyteller, the power of the stories that you're choosing to advance. What stories allow your soul to catch up with you, which is what you're advocating for us?
Well, that's a great question. I think for me, it's the reading and the writing that do it. It's not about finding a story that gives me hope in the kind of, like you sometimes see um, these stories of inspirational stories of, people fighting, long odds to achieve some kind of environmental win. I mean, those stories are great, but I feel like it's actually what the uneasiness of this time and the eeriness, I think, of this moment, at least for me, comes from a sense that these massive changes are happening and we're not really dealing with them on some in any serious way. We hear about something like de-extinction or just the collapse of the Louisiana coast, and it's upsetting and strange, but it kind of stays there in that register often, and I feel that it the only thing that makes that I guess that resolves that tension for me is going deeper into the stories, telling the stories or reading about them and reading great writers like yourself and other people who tell these kinds of stories, and I think there's a tremendous satisfaction in grappling with the ideas, and I think in some ways that's become kind of um, not as the focus of a lot of writing on this subject. I mean, a lot of writing on this subject is is written to galvanize one into action, and I think that's important. It's an important tradition of writing, of course. But I also think there's an important tradition of writing, and you see this with all of the other major crises of our culture, whether civil rights era or anxiety over the atom bomb and so on. That isn't necessarily a position paper, but is an effort to understand the way in which these things are changing us. And so I just find tremendous satisfaction in asking those questions of myself. Because a lot of these questions are subjective, and each one of us has our own answers. How do we deal with this information?
This
So
You've written an extraordinary book about a progression of ideas. And I think, for all of us who read this, you ask the question of, how do we not look away? So I guess my last question as your friend is, how do you find the courage not to look away from all that is breaking our hearts?
I mean, I find that I can't. I think some of these stories, they sink under your skin, right? And I think for some people, it's a healthy response to sort of deny their existence, or you see some headline and you move past it, and I certainly do that too with certain things, but um, I feel that I feel like the writer's responsibility is to write honestly about his or her time, and that if you don't write honestly, the writing becomes false. And I feel like one can't really write about this moment that we're in, this enormous transition, I think, that we're in, without taking in some of this. And so I guess I see no way around it. I mean, I feel like you have to be alive to the moment, and this is what this moment is, that we're living through this massive transition, and we're trying to feel our way through. And so that's what I'm trying to do in the work as well, is to try to feel my own way through, and hope to at least ask some of these questions. If not, I don't have the answers, but I feel like at least posing the questions is itself restorative,
Well,
in its own way.
I think this is one of the most beautiful books I've read in a very long time. This book is alive to the moment, as you are, Nathaniel. And I find that the courage, the strength, the character, and the power of the imagination of the protagonist that you feature is a mirror of who you are as a writer. So thank you for this. And I urge all of you who are with us to purchase this book, talk about it, share it, because I think this gives us the intellectual and the emotional and spiritual strength to do the work that is ours to do in this moment in time. So thank you, my friend. Thank you,
Terry. I'm so grateful to you. Thank you.
For joining us.
Thank you all.
Hi, here I am. Thank you so much, Nathaniel and Terry, for that fantastic conversation. And thanks to all of you out there for spending your evening with us. Please learn more about this incredible book and purchase Second Nature at harvard.com. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night, keep reading, and stay safe. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Love to you both.